Hello and welcome to my webcast, where today I'm going to be talking to you about this, Ring of Bright Water by Gavin Maxwell, very beautiful edition. It's a beautiful and yet also very troubling book. I'm just going to apologise at the start for any camera wobbles. I've balanced my phone on such a tall tower of books, and every time I sort of jolt the table, the whole thing wobbles a bit. So sorry, I hope you don't feel seasick. So Ring of Bright Water, we discussed this on Hampstead Heath on Sunday, and it was so lovely to see so many of you in the sunshine. I felt like in many ways we'd found our own Camus Fianna, which is what he calls his special kind of hideaway place in Scotland. And then for those who couldn't make it, we also had a Zoom on the Monday evening. So it really worked well. We kind of covered all bases. So hopefully you might watch this and decide to join the next one, either on the Heath or on Zoom. So for both discussions, we began with me reading a little bit out from the preface to this book, which I am going to read to you now. I should first of all tell you that this was written in 1959. Gavin Maxwell was a Scottish aristocrat, and he I suppose was, perhaps you could call him as an eccentric. An eccentric, a kind of a doer, a man of immense privilege, a man of action. And as he recounts in the book, one of his other Scottish aristocratic friends owned a big estate and said, you know, why don't you just have this cottage on the edge of it? It might need some repairs, but you can just have it, no one else will touch it. So lucky Gavin got this cottage, which did need a huge amount of work, but he furnished it by basically just by the things he found washed up on the seashore. So old shipping containers he turned into sofas and stuff, which is kind of amazing, that attitude. And he also turned it into I suppose a wildlife sanctuary of sorts, although his treatment of wildlife is probably the troubling element of the book. And he's most known for living there with his otters. But first, we're going to begin with the preface. Okay. Put my specs on. God, it makes me feel like I'm getting quite old. Okay. In writing this book about my home, I have not given to the house its true name. This is from no desire to create mystery. Indeed, it will be easy enough for the curious to discover where I live, but because identification in print would seem in some sense a sacrifice, a betrayal of its remoteness and isolation, as if by doing so I were to bring nearer its enemies of industry and urban life. Camus Fianna, I have called it, the bay of the alders, from the trees that grow along the burn side. But the name is of little consequence, for such bays and houses, empty and long disused, are scattered throughout the wild sea locks of the Western Highlands and the Hebrides. And in the description of one, the reader may perhaps find the likeness of others of which he has himself been fond, for these places are symbols. Symbols, for me and for many, of freedom, whether it be from the prison of overdense communities and the close confines of human relationships, from the less complex incarceration of office walls and hours, or simply freedom from the prison of adult life and an escape into the forgotten world of childhood of the individual or the race. For I am convinced that man has suffered in his separation from the soil and from the other living creatures of the world. The evolution of his intellect has outrun his needs as an animal, and as yet he must still, for security, look long at some portion of the earth as it was before he tampered with it. I think it's such a kind of dense beginning to this book. Of course, a remote cottage in the middle of nowhere is an escape, and perhaps a lot of the magic of the book is longing for an escape in some ways. I mean, on our discussion, we actually wondered if maybe part of being human is longing to escape your current situation. Like, however happy you are, there's always a bit of you that yearns for its opposite. But the fact that he talks about it being an escape, not just from London, but from the close confines of human relationships, or the prison of adult life, an escape into the forgotten world of childhood. You know, it's really a sort of strongly metaphorical escape as well as a literal geographical escape. Of course, you know, October 1959, he stated that. So it would have been a time of mass immigration after the war, and I suppose urban centres would suddenly feel even busier. It was kind of interesting thinking about it today, obviously after all the lockdowns and this sort of crazy year, where so many of us have thought about living in radically different ways. You know, a lot of people have left cities, moved to the countryside, but also perhaps many of us feel that we wouldn't want such isolation. We actually like being with people. And then there's actually another really great bit a few pages later. Can I find the page number? Yes, page 36, where he says, he describes the difference between kind of solitude and loneliness. And he talks about being, you know, in the middle of nowhere. It says, it brings a sense of isolation that is the very opposite of the loneliness a stranger finds in a city. For that loneliness is due to the proximity of other humans and the barriers between him and them, which I think felt very apt for what we've all been going through in this past year. So yeah, kind of very, very big beginning, which I think perhaps helps to explain why this book means so much to people. You know, it's also very beautifully written, and we actually have quite an international group, and so a member from America really talked about the Britishness of its lexicon. One of an Israeli reader couldn't actually kind of read it in English. She couldn't kind of manage the kind of complicated words of it. And also I think it was a Swedish member as well, also kind of struggled with the English. So the language is very poetic and dense. And his descriptions of nature are wonderful. His descriptions of people. He has these little bit parts that are just really perfectly captured, these eccentric characters, like Wilhelmina, who owned the pub and once served American tourists cat food, telling them it was porridge. But really the heart of this book is Maxwell's relationship with otters, in particular one called Midge, who he brings back from Iraq. And this idea of taming a wild animal and sort of living with it in this quite extraordinary way, I think today feels much more discordant than perhaps it did in the 50s. We talked a lot about why he had this impulse for this sort of close affection for these otters, particularly Midge, and then there was another one, Idal, after Midge came to rather a dreadful end. He describes them very anthropomorphically. Maxwell was gay and, you know, didn't have children, and perhaps in a way having otters gives him a chance to kind of be a parent. But in the way he talks about playing with them and all of that, it's also gives him a chance to be a child again too. And, you know, again in the preface it says, you know, it's an escape from the adult world into the world of childhood. There was a lot of kind of pain alongside the freedom that he gave the otters. You know, the pain in transporting them in these kind of sealed boxes that I think Midge, he wrote about how he like cut his hands trying to escape and such distress he caused them, which felt so cruel. And we wondered a little bit about Gavin Maxwell's own experience of love and childhood, and maybe this sort of pain was somehow bound up with it. I mean, maybe that's going a little bit too far, but you know, one of us actually said she felt like the real escape was an escape from boarding school, and that he spent the whole book trying to escape boarding school. So yeah, the relationship with the otters was really at the heart of the book and was what was both fascinating and troubling. But we did also really like that while he wrote about them in a slightly anthropomorphic way, he did learn about humans from the otters. In fact, he particularly noticed how they loved structure and routine, and how when that was taken away, it was totally, they hated it, they couldn't cope, and about how we ourselves kind of need that structure in place, and that was in fact how a lot of us got through the difficult last year when, you know, everything was turned so upside down. So there was actually, it was a great discussion. It was quite a kind of messy discussion in a way. I don't think we drew out any really clear conclusions, and I don't think anyone really came away feeling straightforward about the book. I think even the many of us who really liked it still felt slightly, had some reservations about it. And even the people who weren't so sure about Gavin Maxwell himself were still very intrigued by the book and his life, and the way he just kind of did these wild, extraordinary things. So it's a great book, really, really unusual, a classic for a reason, we felt, and you know, one that I think will stick with us. It was also, I mean, it was such a pleasure reading it in this beautiful edition, and just a shout out here to Little Taller Books, the small Dorset-based publisher who publish a lot of these nature writing classics, also beautifully done. So if you enjoy this, I encourage you to explore their list. Yeah, so now we're going to have a couple of rather rubbish clips from the walk, just to try and give you a feeling of the atmosphere. Thanks for joining me. Hope to see you next time. So this was one of the first stops on our walk. It was actually here that I then got out a bottle of whiskey, which we all enjoyed, having a little wee dram in the spirit of Gavin Maxwell. And this was our final stop by the number 3 pond. It was so beautiful with the sunlight on the water. We could almost imagine Midge swimming up and saying hello. I'm so sorry about my finger in the frame. Absolutely rubbish camera work. It was so nice to see everyone chatting. Even with the masks on, it felt almost like old times. So thanks for joining me, and hope to see you next time.